Hello, everyone. I am pretty much on time tonight. So this is going to be the fifth and final video where I discuss the novel. But I'm also going to probably do a couple little videos on a few things. I wanted to create one video specifically for my Trump supporting friends. I think I'm gonna do that tomorrow and just maybe discuss the election, kind of some differing views on how everything might play out. And I thought I'd start out tonight just talking about the election that's coming up for tomorrow, and just give some thoughts on that. So there's a lot of us on both sides of the political spectrum, or on all sides of the political spectrum, who are pretty nervous about the outcome for tomorrow. And so I just wanted to say a few things about some expectations for what we might be experiencing. So, you know, in my novel, the first chapter opens with the discussion of the 2020 election. And in that scenario, the way I played it out was that the president, on election night, as the vote totals seem to be going in his favor, basically declares that he's the winner, and, you know, all is lost from that point forward. You know, Supreme Court supports his analysis of it. The military stays neutral. There aren't any systems in place for getting him removed. So we just end up stuck with him. So I'm sincerely hoping that is not the outcome that we're dealing with. I talked to a reporter today, and he told me, he said, well, but if that's the outcome, you'll sell a lot more of your books. And I thought, you know, I'd be very happy not selling books. So let's just hope that that doesn't come to pass. So let's talk about a few things that might take place tomorrow. So number one, since the president's supporters tend to be less concerned about the coronavirus in general, there probably are going to be more of those folks voting in person on election day. And many of the folks who are concerned about the coronavirus have done absentee ballots or early in-person voting. But in many of those locations across the country, there's been moves by the Republican Party to make it to where any votes that come in after November 3rd, even if they're postmarked by November 3rd, should not be legally counted. Now, I just want to give a little context. That is extremely unusual. That is not something that is the norm. Pretty much with elections, we have, you know, the in-person voting, and then we have absentee ballots that are coming in, you know, for a period of time after the election. But in the past, if it was postmarked by election day, it was considered a perfectly legally valid vote. But now, with so much contesting of this, you know, that this could be a source of concern. So one of the reasons that the president is contesting it is that he anticipates that many of those votes are not going to be for him. And so what he is hoping is that on election night, he has a very, very high in-person voter count, and that the count starts going in his favor. And he has already announced that he plans to then declare victory. So what we as citizens need to be aware of is that, you know, just because he declares victory does not mean that he has actually won, and that we need to be following legal processes for counting the vote. You know, we can't just decide that because the president is saying he won, and that the votes, or that some of the votes are coming in postmarked, you know, by election day, but after the fact, that means there's some sort of election stealing or election rigging that's happening. He's going to say that. He's going to say that the election is rigged, most likely. So what we need to do as citizens is just be patient and calm and aware that whatever he says is not necessarily relevant on election night, that we have systems in place, legal systems in place for determining the winner of an election. So I am hopeful that we do not see pure chaos tomorrow night. And, you know, there's part of me that's remaining hopeful that maybe we'll get a huge in-person turnout for Biden, and that you know, that he will be the obvious winner, in which case it will be very, very hard for the president to declare victory and to say the election is rigged and all that stuff. He'll do it. He'll do it regardless. I mean, let's just get that in our heads. No matter what happens with the election, the president is going to say that it was stolen from him and that it's not legitimate and, you know, was rigged in some way. So he's going to say that. Let's just assume that that's what he's going to say, regardless of the outcome of the election. But for everyone else beside the president and his, very hardcore supporters, a clear Biden victory will probably be enough to get him out of office. So if you have not voted, please make sure that you get out tomorrow and vote. I know it's going to be, a little challenging for some folks, but there are people, whose polling places should be just fine, easy peasy, get in and get out. This is the most important election of our lives. I know that, people like to make fun of this, but never before have we had such clear authoritarianism on the ballot. So, is Biden the perfect candidate? Is he everything we all want in a candidate? No, many of us. But he is not an authoritarian. He does not plan to become a dictator. And I know a common thing that's said on the Trump side, and I'm trying to address this in my video directly to Trump supporters, is that often they'll say, well, if we have to have a dictator, we'd rather our dictator. Because they've been so convinced that Biden is planning on taking over the country in some dictatorial way. I guess I can't say that for sure, but Biden has never expressed any authoritarian tendencies, whereas Trump pretty much talks about becoming an authoritarian every day, multiple times per day. So I don't think we can really trust, especially since the president lies so much, I don't think we can really trust that what he is saying has any validity whatsoever about Biden. There has not been any evidence that Biden is looking to create a dictatorship. So I'm going to trust the evidence, So one of the things that people talk about, we're going to talk about narcissism for just a half second. I'm drinking hot tea tonight as a calming skill here, or a way to calm me. Okay, so one of the things that with narcissists, is that they will always claim that there was something stolen from them. They will never be happy with the result if it isn't looking like something that they want. So let's just be aware of that. That's probably going to happen. Let's see. I was going to say something else about that, but I forgot. Okay, so, and then the final thing I guess I'll just say on that before we jump into the chapter is if in fact the president declares victory and is trying to stop the vote count and is clearly trying to rig the elections, because almost everything the president says, just know it's what he's doing and it's the opposite of the truth. Okay, so that's just a good rule of thumb with the president. So, if in fact he is going to declare victory, stop the vote count, do all of these different things, there is a national mobilization that's taking place in order to address this. So please go to protectthevote.org and sign up for a rally in your local area just in case. We're going to find out Wednesday morning whether or not we're going to pull the trigger on those rallies. And if these are going to happen, they'll probably be weekly protests until we can figure out what's going on with the presidency. So just be aware, protectthevote.org. I encourage you to go to sign up now just in case. And then if, in fact, there's 3 different triggers, I can't remember what those triggers are, we're going to be peacefully assembling across the nation to make our voices heard. So I just want to, address this little, common thing that's told about folks on the left end of the political spectrum, that when we're protesting, we're violent, we're looting, we're doing all these things. Yes, there was some, looting during the George Floyd thing, but we've already established it's pretty much white nationalists coming in, infiltrating those protests. So we do need to be aware of that with this, these national protests, that white nationalists and other agitators on the right will attempt to create violence and looting and things like that to discredit the movement. So we have to be very, very aware of that. Number one. But number two, I really don't know anybody who has ever been out there thinking, we're going to be shooting people up and doing this sort of thing. We need to have peaceful protests and civil disobedience, in my opinion, too. If you look at, for example, India, some of the Gandhi's movement in order to kick out the British was mass civil disobedience. And so, I think we'll be looking at some of those, activists across the country will be looking at some of those things. But for any of you on the right who might be catching this video, we're not talking about violent protests. We're talking about peaceful protests. And if you remember, or the First Amendment is, literally the very first part of the Constitution, the Bill of Rights. And in that is the right to peacefully assemble. And so a lot of folks on the right want to talk about concern about their rights being taken away and things like that, primarily around guns, and some miscommunication or misunderstanding of the right to freedom of speech that maybe I'll talk about in my Trump video. I think that it's often lost that the First Amendment is the first for a reason. A peaceful assembly throughout the entire history of humanity has been a force for good and change. So hopefully we won't need it. Hopefully we'll have a peaceful transition of power. Hopefully the election results will be very clear. That's, what we all hope, but let's see what happens. Okay? All right, enough about that. Let's get into chapter 16. So chapter 16 is called North Star. And that's because they're traveling to the north and they're using the North Star at one point as part of their guide. So, and I kind of like that idea of lunar navigation, that goes beyond all of the instruments and things like that we have. And although she does make an instrument, Lauren does make an instrument, but, low-tech instrument. Okay, so let's see. In this chapter, if you remember back in 15, the federal government had raided the resistance camp that they were in. And so now they're continuing to head through the forests of northern Minnesota and southern Canada in order to get to this ecological city called Nasia that I've named. And, in this journey, it's pretty grueling. And there's some stuff that happens, particularly around disease release. So I'm using this chapter in a little way to talk about a potential public health threat in the future. And that is the tundra thawing. So we talked about this a little bit in feedback loops in the last video. So if there are feedback loops that are melting the tundra, then all that methane is coming to the surface, right? So that's one feedback loop. But intertwined with that is the fact that many carcasses of animals and dead bodies of humans have been buried and frozen in that tundra for a really long time. Some of these carcasses and bodies are going to contain diseases that humanity has not seen or that we have not seen as much of. And so that's something that we need to be kind of thinking about. Already, I'm pretty sure in Russia there was an outbreak of smallpox because one of their cemeteries was thawing, and there were a lot of victims of the smallpox pandemic from forever ago who were buried in there. So I think, that's something we're going to need to be aware of. In my book, I talk about anthrax, which is a disease we have nowadays, but it's also something that could be becoming more common. And there's other diseases and viruses that scientists are finding that we haven't even really encountered before. So, let's hope that in the days of thawing tundra, we don't end up with crazy diseases running through the population, but, that is a potential. So I think, with climate change, we're seeing so many different ways in which it's affecting things, and I don't think we're always clued in about all those different ways. And the disease releasing organisms, I think, is not really on people's radar, even though it's super scary. Okay, so we're talking about that. So they're trying to get to Canada, but again, let's remind you, in my novel, Canada has become Kanata with a K. And the reason for that was that the Canadian Supreme Court at some point in my fictitious world decided that the lands had been taken illegally, and so they returned it to the native name of Kanata. Let's see. I actually did write the Canadian Indigenous Council and told them what my plan was for that and asked them what they thought, and I never heard back from them. I'm sure they're not super pleased with the idea of yet another novel of American refugees fleeing to Canada. I'm sure they're not super happy about that. So actually, let's just talk about that for a second real quick. So one of the things I've long thought about is that, Americans have been very insulated in terms of a lot of the problems of the world with regard to like refugees and things like that. okay, obviously we're getting some, on the border, but like we ourselves have really not ever, for recent memory, have needed to be refugees or to be sheltered from the rest of, through refugee camps or Doctors Without Borders or other international organizations coming in, taking care of us and protecting us. But in this new world order that I've created, this is more common because America is reducing its capacity to take care of its citizens, that sort of thing. So we're going to be experiencing some of these similar type problems as the rest of the world already. For our elections, this is a first. So usually in like dictatorship type countries, there will be international election monitors to make sure the election goes smoothly and is not cheated. Unfortunately, now we have international election monitors coming to monitor our election. So that really sucks in terms of the necessity of it. But of course, it's a good thing in terms of helping keep an eye on things. So I don't know how extensive those monitors are going to be, but yeah, they are coming because our elections used to be kind of one of the standards of the world of considered democratic. And I don't think we can take that, for granted anymore. So that's one thing. And then in this world, I said Canada probably wasn't super happy about the idea of this. Not that my novel is going to spur some big Canadian immigration. It's already happening. And it's been happening throughout the time of the Trump administration. And they're reducing the amount of visas that they're making available to Americans. And, it just kind of makes sense that, whenever there's, countries that are bordering each other, when one is more in chaos, often people will be seeking refuge in the more stable place. So Canada's clearly the more stable place right now. But also in this world, I wanted to kind of project out a little bit more. So in one scene, we're having Rachel talk about, possibly hiring coyotes to get them over the border, and that's something I think with our immigration or immigrants coming to our country, we're not really able to put ourselves in their place in terms of like people fleeing violence and chaos and drugs and lack of resources, lack of jobs, things like this. We're really not very often able to imagine if we were in that situation as Americans. And so I was trying to paint a picture as if we could more easily place ourselves in a situation where that was something we needed. So, Canada, it's no secret, they're not closing their border, but they're reducing the amount of immigration they're allowing. In this, chaotic world I'm presenting, there would be a rush of refugees. And so Canada's really shut that down. So yeah, an American trying to get across the border would need something like to do it illegally or whatever, have, a coyote to take them across. And then Americans would be looked at as and I kind of go through this in the town that they get to in Canada, a little bit like riffraff, we're not the creme de la creme anymore, more just like, oh yeah, there's this, Americans trying to find their space or, we're refugees, for all intents and purposes at that point. And so, we tend to live these very comfortable existences at this stage still, where that's still not something we need to be thinking about, but maybe not so much in the future. And I would just encourage people to be perhaps a little more generous or sensitive to the fact that refugees are in crisis. That's why they're refugees, that nobody wants to pick up home and start traipsing across the country or the world just for fun. They're going for a reason. Now, of course, there's always some who are just seeking better opportunity, but the vast majority of them are fleeing violence or, just pure lack of anything to be able to survive. So there you go. Okay, we got that in chapter 15. I'm going to do a little reading. Okay, this is chapter 16. Okay, so also what we're dealing with in chapter 16 is Lauren continuing her emotional journey. So she kind of makes some major strides in her development as a person through this chapter. She starts out in life, or in the book, not really being able to deal with much. Life is pretty overwhelming for her. And so what I'm trying to do with this chapter a little bit is to, sorry, I hate my light. I don't know why it's making me look awful. Sorry, everybody. I feel like I look awful. Anyway, I'm going to ignore how I look. Whatever. So in this chapter, sorry, I'm always losing my train of thought. I don't know why. I think I haven't been getting enough sleep. I've been really stressed out about this election and my puppy. I haven't been sleeping. Okay. So, oh yeah, Lauren's emotional journey. Sorry. So, so she's learning the skills to be able to handle difficult things. And she's learning this from a variety of different people through her life. From Rosa, we heard about in one of the first chapters, was kind of a mentor to her. And, Eric, her husband, has kind of mentored her in his own way. Pedro, from the resistance camp, has also done some work around helping her develop some of her emotional coping skills. So, but she's really being put to the test here in this trip through the forest to Canada because I mentioned disease, so a member of their party gets very, very seriously ill. And Lauren is just kind of struggling with how to keep herself amidst all of this pain and chaos that she's dealing with. And so I wanted to read a little bit about that because it felt really appropriate for the day that I'm doing this on. A lot of us are stressed out. I mentioned I was stressed out about the election. I was on Twitter today and so many people were like, oh, I'm already stress drinking. There's a lot of people who are really, really stressed out right now. And so one of the things that I have done through my work with, my own journey and with my children is, being able to figure out how to manage these big feelings and to be able to keep moving forward. Okay, so that's one of the things I want to talk about. So Lauren is kind of finally learning some of these skills, and we're going to pick up with that. Rachel could barely catch her breath. Lauren ached for her as if she herself were infirm. She was being consumed and tried desperately to cobble together something to cling to, lest she be lost. Gliding around in her consciousness were the words of those who had helped her understand parts of herself and how to just be during hard times. Lauren took in the surroundings. For all the sadness of the changes of the forest to the world, there was still beauty. She tried to focus her feelings on her sister's presence rather than feeling her entire being. She looked at the pools of water collected on the ragged surface of the stone. She focused on being there, then. Rosa had talked to her about her love for her family and how that had kept her centered when she felt like spinning out of control. And yet it was Lauren's affection for Rachel that was the cause of her spinning now. Lauren took in the kids and Eric who were collapsed on their own massive boulders. Her family was beautiful. The slate gray rock upon which they sat was beautiful, with its crevices and bunches of tough lichen that would outlive them all. That rock, born of lava 2 billion years before, was as worn as Lauren felt. She pressed both her palms against its surface and felt the electric energy of time and space, love and the circle of life weaved together. She gazed about the forest and felt calm. The saplings bursting forth into life, surrounding them were beautiful, as was the ice and the branches shining in the afternoon light. These were the places hope lived. Lauren knew that to find peace she needed to take it in moment by moment. Lauren did not want Rachel to die, but she knew that one day she would, as would she and nearly everyone she'd met. Not nearly everyone she'd met. What mattered most was the sliver of time before her eyes, not dwelling in the past nor obsessing about a future she couldn't control. She also realized that she had not felt like taking her own life for so long she'd nearly forgotten the urge. She put her head back and closed her eyes, feeling the warmth of the sun on her face. She thought of the rhythms of the earth and the solace and the constancy of moonrises and sunsets. She imagined the stars up in the sky. She breathed in confidence that she would be all right. And some of that is a bit personal in terms of like the specific way that Lauren is coping with things. That's something that I learned to do many years ago or had started doing many years ago. So it actually, so my youngest son, James, we had fostered him for the first 5 months of his life, and then he went back to his birth mom for 2 years. And I was always worried about him when he was with his birth mom because although I love her. We have a really good relationship now. We're friends, talk on the phone fairly routinely, and when it's safe, we do see her, and the boys have a relationship. But for those 2 years he was gone, I knew she didn't have much of a support system, and I was really worried about James. So there'd be times that I would go outside and I would sit and I would look at the moon and I would think about him, and I would think about how I don't know where he is or what's happening in his life, but at least we're all under that same moon. So some of this was inspired by kind of that way of like connecting to the earth, the rhythms of the earth, the nature, and that has helped me some in coping with some difficult things. So anyway, so Lauren is doing that as well. Let's see. So let's move on to chapter 17. Chapter 17 was a super fun chapter for me to write, and I really liked the characters in that. So in chapter 17, we're going to meet two brand new characters, so we haven't met. I think I maybe alluded to them quite a bit earlier in the novel. But these are James and Ruby Abbott, and they are Black Americans who have pretty different walks of life. So Ruby grew up in a two-parent household with really strict parents who, drove her education. James also had a strict mom who drove his education, but it was a single mother. And Ruby was more middle class, and James was, a little bit more in poverty. But they both ended up at Tulane University in New Orleans. I wanted to write about New Orleans for a few reasons. Number one, it probably is my favorite city in the U.S. I adore New Orleans. I've been there a couple times now, and I write about it as if it has its own vibe and all that. And it from what I can experience, it really does. It's a very unique city. It has a very different non-United States feel, I guess you could say. So I kind of put that in the book too. You sort of, when you're in NOLA, you have a grasp of maybe being somewhere else as well. And, the population is very diverse, but it's also the architecture, the way the streets are designed, things of that nature too. So I love New Orleans. But more so than that, I wanted to bring in Hurricane Katrina. And I wanted to bring in Hurricane Katrina, even though it's, kind of ancient history. It was, I don't even remember when Hurricane Katrina was. It feels like a really long time ago. But Katrina was kind of one of the very first really in-depth warning signs that climate change was upon us. It was a much larger than normal storm that they had seen. And then, of course, because of the aftermath with the storm surges and the levees breaking, ended up being an absolute catastrophe for New Orleans. And then that was the other piece that I wanted to bring into it, too, was kind of some of the racial and economic justice facets of climate change that Katrina really highlighted for us. So, when Katrina hit, theoretically, the city should have been safe. The levees should have been able to protect the city. And then, let's say the levees fail. So I also want to talk a little bit about the oil and gas industry as long as we're on that, but I'll get back to it. But, if the levees failed, then theoretically there would be rescue systems in place and, things to help people when all that happened. But what we saw with Katrina was, it was disorganization at every level of government. I'm not going to say it was just George W. Bush, although he, certainly claims or deserves a lot of the responsibility for what happened. But really it was, a failure at multiple levels of government that were not taking it seriously, that we had a very poor population who had little resources to flee the storm on their own. So that was kind of ignored. And so a lot of people talk about Katrina as really a tremendous justice issue because, had that storm befallen, primarily white affluent community, yes, there would have been flooding, most likely. There would have been destruction, but there would not have been the absolute profound devastation that we saw with Katrina, and the complete and total lack of effective management of the crisis after it hit in terms of helping people to get out of New Orleans and to save them. I mean, in my book, I have like a Creole fisherman who's helping my main characters to escape. And that was really common, that people just got in their boats and went because there was no effective government response. And I think in a world where government is continuing to fray, we're going to see more and more of that. Because, ironically enough, in societies, depending on the level of chaos, in many societies, as long as there's not a lot of violent chaos per se, people can actually draw together a little bit more. They aren't necessarily looking for someone external to help them out, so they take a little more responsibility for their friends and neighbors. And so, if we can get through this whole situation and get to a less violent, perhaps more stable country, even if things are not necessarily great, doesn't mean they're going to be terrible for us as individual citizens as long as we can get our acts together. So in New Orleans after Katrina, you did see a lot of just average citizens jumping in the fray to help out their friends and neighbors. But let's talk about why the city flooded. So number one, the levee system needed to be designed properly and needed to be maintained properly, right? But again, this is a poor Black city. And so there's a lot of, reporting and things that have been done that the Corps of Engineers simply did not take the maintenance and the construction of the levees as seriously as they should have. They were not, and there were, I'm pretty sure I just recently read a report that someone had been trying to raise the alarm bells before Katrina that, look, these levees are really unsafe, and no one was listening. So we have that governmental failure. But let's also talk, so in my novel, James and Ruby are in Katrina. They are some of them who are stranded, and a terrible, terrible thing happens with their family, and I don't want to give that away. But, they're really devastated by it. So I'm using Katrina to kind of talk about their family, but also to talk about these systemic issues. So, there's this systemic racial and economic injustice that I say is as responsible for the flooding and the deaths as the storm itself. And I believe that. But I also wanted to talk about Katrina for another reason. So when I was there both times, we did the swamp tours, so you get on a little boat and you go out and look for alligators and all that. And it's super fun. I mean, I love doing it. But when you're doing it, you're often going through the canals that have been created by the oil and gas industry through the swamps. And why did they create these canals? Well, they created them so they could get out to their rigs. So to me, this also was, Katrina was also able to kind of tie together so many pieces of climate change and coastal destruction and the oil and gas industry and how all that fit together, racial and economic injustices. So Katrina was really a great example of all these different things that we're dealing with as a society. So let's talk about the swamps, okay, and kind of the ecological destruction that also allowed Katrina to be as bad as it is. Sorry, I keep drinking my tea here, guys. I'm trying to have it while it's warm. Okay, so with the oil and gas industry putting these canals through the swamps are kind of the first line of defense. Swamps are sort of the buffer from the storm surge, okay? So if you have a healthy, intact swamp system, that is going to slow significantly a storm surge from a hurricane. But because we have all these canals gone through, the swamps are really being devastated. So there's a lot of salt water that's coming into them. So killing them off in that way, just the canals that are being put through is disrupting the ecological life of them. I don't know exactly why, but basically we're also seeing a massive, massive erosion of the Louisiana coastline. And that also is reducing the capacity to buffer storms. So we've got that. And then, of course, what is the oil and gas industry removing from, why do they need these canals? To get to their oil rigs. Well, what does oil do? So oil is bringing, when we burn it, we're bringing carbon to the surface. Of course, we also had the Deepwater Horizon, just beyond horrific oil spill right around in that part of the world too. So we're definitely dealing with oil spills as well. But setting that aside for a second, just even the gas, even if there's no spills, the gas that we're pulling up out of there is going to create pollution. That pollution is creating a hotter planet, making the oceans hotter, therefore more storms, less, blunting of the storm surge from the swamps. So, it's just kind of a emblematic of kind of all of these different things that are happening. So in my novel, James and Ruby, they have this terrible tragedy happen, and they've already been kind of activists. I don't really indicate environmental activists per se, but kind of social justice activists. But after this happens, they really turn their attention to climate change, and they realize how climate change in many ways is an overarching justice issue, because the people who will be affected by climate change are most affected, shall I say, are unilaterally going to be the most vulnerable, the most poor, elderly, sick, disabled, like we talked about with the Darwinism in the last video. So I think James and Ruby as activists are looking at this and going, oh, this one issue is not only had this effect on our family, but is also going to really devastate the world and wipe out a lot of the progress we're making on other things. And for me personally, climate change is sort of the way I see it, is that, in that I care about everything. I care about $15 an hour minimum wage. I care about childcare. I care, all these things, education, all of it. It's super, super important, and I care. But if we do not start addressing climate change, more and more of our budget as a society and more of our energy is going towards mitigation and managing this crisis. So there won't be resources left over for managing these other things that we care about. There won't be the capacity to be able to address these problems we're concerned about if we don't start getting a handle on climate change. So to me, climate change really is, aside the emergency of the United States election, is the second most important thing that we have got to start taking seriously. Otherwise, nothing else we care about will matter. If we care about pollution, forest fires, protecting forests, endangered species, all of it, justice issues, poverty, all of it gets wrapped up into climate change. So to me, that really is the most important or pressing issue that we've got to start dealing with. Okay, so I'm going to read a little bit from James and Ruby's chapter. Oh, wait. Before we get to that, two more things. Okay, one of the reasons this chapter was so fun is because James and Ruby are wonderful environmental, rights justice activists, end up becoming billionaires. And I'm not going to tell you how they become billionaires, but I really loved writing that. Actually, the original version had a lot more about how it all came about and all this stuff, and I had to cut most of that. So basically, we cut to the chase. They're billionaires. It was really fun to write, a kind of a positive story for people, because so much of my book is negative. So I appreciated being able to add James and Ruby as, having some success in their life. So, and James and Ruby are also very scientifically oriented. So, one of the, so that's a lot of the reason why they're concerned about climate change as well, is because they're really paying attention to science. And Ruby's an anthropologist, so I kind of stole that from my own history. But she is now, I guess, this dynamic speaker who's going out and doing all these speaking tours. And while she's speaking, there are a lot of other billionaire rich people who come up to her and talk to her about these underground eco bunkers that they've got. So I wanted to spend some time in this chapter on that too, because I think it's sort of a folly that a lot of super wealthy people are investing so much money. Well, it is a folly. Investing so much money in these mega expensive fancy bunkers. And I think it's for a number of reasons. One, James, my character, he's an engineer. So he likes to point out that, these bunkers are being built by the same, corrupt, incompetent companies that are doing a lot of corrupt, incompetent things and not building things properly. So you're really going to trust, your whole family to be underground in a system that is 100% required to have everything work in order for you to live, or you're going to be trapped down there. That to me was kind of an interesting thought when I started putting that together. It's really risky to presume it's all going to work, right? Might be better to save the planet than to think of that as the backup plan. So it was kind of my motivation for this this part of the chapter was like, I doubt any billionaire is going to be reading my book and, worried about their bunker or whatever. But just kind of the concept I wanted to explore of how silly it is to think that there's going to be some alternative to surviving on this planet. So that was one. And then the other thing is Ruby's talking about these bunkers is like you're already dead. You might as well already be dead and buried if you're going to live underground. And I sort of kind of think that a little bit myself. I can barely stand being in a room without windows for the day, let alone living in an underground bunker. So I just kind of wanted to address that as like, let's quit thinking science and technology are going to fix us. Let's start looking at what we can do on this planet itself to mitigate the problems, because there are many, many things we can do to mitigate, so let's just talk about that a little bit. In an earlier chapter, I had discussed kind of this idea that technology was going to save us. And I think a lot of us sort of have that perception, that humans are so sophisticated and technological and we have such great science, we're just going to figure it out. But I think that's a bit of a arrogance on our part, because we don't really have the technologies exactly worked out to figure it out. And these are major global climatic systems that we can't just intervene in however we want to. They have their own thing that's going on. And, humans are not as sophisticated as we think we are in terms of having all that figured out. But more importantly than that is, I think, something to talk about a lot on that podcast Hot Take that I've talked about. More importantly than that technology can't solve the problem, because I do think there's a role of technology. Absolutely. I'm not saying there's no role of technology. But I think the same people who are getting rich off of causing the problems, or the same companies, many of them are trying to get rich off of solving the climate change problem. And through technology and unproved technology that we don't know if it's going to work. We don't know if it's going to solve the problems. But there are lots of things we already know that solve the problem or can address the problem in a very profound way, and that aren't tech and don't cost a bunch of money, and there isn't going to be a divide, a haves and have-nots with. And that is planting things. So I talked about in one of the earlier chapters, Dale, the father, how he was so proud of his prairie pastures, because he was like, basically giving the speech, like, technology isn't going to fix it. It's going to be we're going to plant our way out of it. And so I just want to dwell on that for a second here. So my master's research was on women landowners in Iowa, women farm landowners. And all those years ago, I thought, wouldn't it be amazing if we could get some of these women landowners to start converting their lands to prairie? And I was aware of climate change back then, but I wasn't as aware of how ingenious of a solution planting prairie is. I mean, planting prairie is really one of, in trees are some of our number one tools to address climate change, because prairie is going to be absorbing a lot of carbon, and their root systems are super deep, and they're going to be just shoving that carbon down back into the soils. So prairie is really important, and I think if we could get a lot of the Midwest replanted to that, particularly lands that aren't being used, like CRP, Conservation Reserve Program lands, things like that, we could start having programs to help farmers get their animals out of feedlots and get them back on pasture, especially fragile lands with a lot of erosion. Here I'm pulling up my sustainable agriculture hat, sorry. But, these sorts of things could greatly be addressing the problem, in addition to planting forests. So we have this, trillion tree initiative globally that we're ostensibly participating in, although I don't know how much we're doing as a country. But that would definitely be helpful. Stopping the destruction of the Amazon forest, unfortunately, also has to be part of this solution, because if that forest gets too much more destroyed, it will completely and totally shift global weather patterns. And I don't know what will happen with all that, so that's pretty concerning. But if we can manage the destruction of the forest and we can stop cutting it down, and perhaps even replanting some of that. I don't think we realize how much of climate change we could really address. We don't need big mirrors in space, for God's sakes. We don't need to be pouring chemicals into the ocean. I mean, some of these plans that people have, frankly, are like kind of insane when you have a completely low-tech solution that's actually pretty affordable, we know will solve the problem, that's readily available, and yet we keep, pushing these technological solutions. So I would just encourage us to be very suspicious of people who tell us that they have technology that's going to fix climate change. Let's focus on what we know how to do before we start spending billions of dollars on fancy stuff to make other people rich. Okay, so let's read a little bit. So I'm going to read a speech that Ruby gives to these rich donors. It's a fun speech to write, or it was a fun speech for me to write. The title of this chapter is called Laws. And the reason why I chose laws is because, again, just kind of addressing humanity's arrogance a little bit. We don't tend to think of ourselves as subject to these same laws of nature, of physics, of biology, chemistry, etc., that every other species is on this planet. But we are. We are a natural organism. We're mammals. We're biological organisms. We are subject to all of these laws of the universe as other creatures and other, entities on this planet. The difference is we have, skills and tools and we can adapt, but at the end of the day, we're still as subject to these laws. So I feel a good deal of what has gotten us into this trouble, both with COVID, with climate change, other things, is that Americans are very scientifically illiterate overall. We don't really understand science very well. And I'm a big science nerd. I love science. One of my first things, I wanted to be a wildlife biologist when I was first going to college. Changed my major after I got my associate degree in biology. But, very interested in science always. And studying about how the natural world works. So Ruby is giving a speech where she's kind of lecturing the audience, okay, on laws of nature and whatnot. Scientific laws, that's the word I'm trying to get. Okay. Humanity is as subject to physics, chemistry, and biology as any creature on this planet. These are the laws above the laws of men. They are the laws of nature, and we are in need of paying attention to these as you all should be to the laws of security fraud. But I'm here today to tell you that it's this fantastical thinking that humans are so unique and separate, somehow above it all, that what's gotten us into this mess in the first place. Ruby never got past bracing for this next portion of her speech. I do not mean to cause offense to you lovely and so generous people, but you are the very folks who need to be taking this message in. Those of you who are living comfortable lives still, who think you're insulated because of your wealth and your power, that the chaos that's somehow enveloping our planet will not touch you. You personally and your families are subject to these same laws. And it's happening now, right now, not in our children's generation, but in our generation. The planet we need to survive is changing in ways that you may not be able to envision. And most of it seems far away and nebulous to you. I know, I hear you. Ruby would get the audience involved to keep their attention, which was why she drew a packed crowd, despite the sullen topic. She'd ask a list of questions and ask for a show of hands for anyone who could say yes to one of them. Don't believe me that climate change is here now? Let me prove it. Who here has or knows someone who's been affected by an unexpected or usual flood? Okay, keep your hands up. If you can say yes to another, put your other hand up. If you get to 3, stand up. Now, show me if you've dealt with wildfires outside of what used to be wildfire season. How about record-setting heat waves, Arctic cold snaps, drought, major hurricanes, massive tornadoes, derechos? She would go on until nearly everyone was standing. Look around you. This is the face of climate change. Ruby's voice mixed somber and sarcasm for her close. You can't fight chemistry, folks. The air is different now than it was. Call it the atmosphere if you like, but that tiny bubble we're breathing is filling up with carbon and methane and other gases that we're putting up there, and it's holding too much heat. You can argue as much as you want that this isn't true, but the evidence is there, and it's been there for a long time. It used to not even be controversial, if you can believe that. Even the party knew it was real. Because these are the laws of nature, folks. Science doesn't care if you believe it. Science doesn't care about your feelings. If you have a problem with the science, you don't have a problem with me. You've got a problem with the forces, natural or supernatural, that made those laws. Humanity cannot change them. No matter how much power or technology we have, whether you write me a check today isn't what matters, though, of course, you should do that. What matters is what all of us can do to make a difference. Many people ask me if I think people will go extinct. No one can know the answer to that, least alone me. But I also reject the question. I do, because I find it unproductive. For me, the real question is, how will humanity survive? Will we implement the solutions that we already know and vigorously pursue new answers? Or will we allow a slow descent into chaos? And I put that in there specifically because, I was inspired by an article from Fred Kirshenman, for those in the sustainable ag world, who wrote an article many years ago, Can Organic Agriculture Feed the World, and is that the right question? And I always liked that title because it reminded me of, we have to ask the right questions. So to me, will humanity go extinct? A lot of people talk about that. I mean, I hear that frequently. And I think that's a silly question, or it's not a relevant question, because between now and extinction, at the very least, we're going to be going through really hard times. And so let's not get hung up on whether or not our species can survive climate change, okay? We don't know the answer to that. But if we don't do anything about climate change, let's just pretend we're in a world where nothing changes, just keeps going. I don't know if we can survive that, okay? But let's assume, we are able to start getting a handle on it, and we are starting to be able to adapt. The question is, how will those people how will we make sure people aren't getting left behind? The people in the poor countries, or the poor people in our country, for goodness sakes. How are we going to make sure that there's justice and equity in this new world where, we're not just letting some people suffer, or the majority of the population suffer, while the super wealthy go and hide in their bunkers? Because that's what the super wealthy have planned for the situation. And, the rest of us kind of struggling to survive, our children, our grandchildren. This doesn't sound super awesome. So I'd really like us to start addressing this before that happens. So anyway, that's chapter 17. Let's move on to chapter 18. That's the last kind of main chapter of the story. After chapter 18, I jump ahead to kind of almost kind of an epilogue, but it's not exactly an epilogue. Okay, so in chapter 18, I'm naming the city Medina, and I noticed at least one point Wendy was watching. I don't know if she still is, but Wendy was the one who gave me the name or some suggestions for places I could find names. So the name of that city came directly from that. I believe she's a Ukrainian goddess of the earth or something to that effect. But I also chose that name because it kind of tied into the word Medina. So in an original version of my novel, and actually the chapter is up on my website, Rachel, the sister, goes to Morocco and is really experiencing the ecological architecture of the Medina. So the Medina is it was built for defense and for cooling. So it's like a huge, almost circular type city with walls surrounding it for protection. But then within the walls, the city is really kind of jaggy around. And some of that was built that way because the sun coming in is not able to just flood and heat the city, that it's, constantly casting shadows. So when I was in Morocco, I first started out in the new city that was built by it was built by the French. And it was just, oh my goodness, first of all, ugly. Just bland concrete, chipping paint, big wide roads, boulevards, very similar designed looking city to what we would think of, from Rochester, any of our cities. But then I got my clothes changed and I went over to the Medina, which is much more of an interesting part of Fez, which was where I was at. In the Medina, it was shocking how, almost instantaneously you felt much cooler being in that space. And it was literally because it was built, architecturally to reduce the climate impact, not climate change, but the impact of the heat in that part of the world. And so I really wanted to bring in the concept of how we can be mitigating for some of these problems through architecture. And so James and Ruby were inspired to build their original city of Nassia also with these ecological design principles, and then Medina is the sister city, because what they're experiencing, so they've got Nassia, it's all great, but then Medina was kind of the sister city that was built but was going to be completed by the residents. So it's not completed. So Lauren and her party get there. They get to Medina. It's not done yet. They're kind of shocked. They don't sort of know how to react to the fact that it's not done. But, they've gotten through the forest. So I should back up a little bit in the story just in case it's confusing. So we had the last chapter with Lauren and their party. They were in the city in Kanata, and they met this doctor who is going to help get them to the eco city of Nassia. He doesn't quite tell them all what's going on, though. So anyway, they get there in Medina. Lauren figures out what's going on, and then they reconnect with Pedro. So Pedro was the one, if you remember a couple chapters back, he's the one who gave Lauren the garrote. He had taught her about weaponry and kind of defending herself. So he survives the raid on the federal camp. He ends up in Medina also. And then he basically says, hey, we got this city, it's falling apart. Me and you could do this great job running this city. Let's run for the presidency of Medina. Because it happens to be there's an election right around that time. So I'm kind of using this chapter as a way to do a couple things. Originally, I wanted to spend more time talking about the ecological adaptation of the city. And I really, really wanted to, when I had to cut that out of the book, I wanted to at least do like a rundown of what features are there of this city, like a dome over it to kind of regulate weather and air filtration systems. And I spent a lot of time talking about the food system, because in, food, part of the reason I got attracted to sustainable agriculture as my original, profession was because the impact of food production on the environment is just profound. And I'm from Iowa, and of course that's the entire landscape is food production. So there's a lot of efforts being made to make food systems more sustainable, obviously, but also to reduce the amount of kind of inputs and everything that need to come into creating that food. So one of the things I just recently read about was this protein that's produced without any, plants or animals. I can't quite remember how they produce the protein, but it's this really plain protein. But in my future, I'm thinking, something like that could be, we're using more, has very, very low impact. If it's put into food, we wouldn't necessarily taste bad or what have you. So in the original version of my novel, there was quite a bit about that kind of stuff and their farming systems and relationship to animals and all this good stuff. I really wanted to talk about that stuff. It just was too much. I couldn't really work it into the story. So at some point I might do little synopsis and throw it up on the website of this type of thing. But in this chapter, I had to cut out a lot of that, but we do, mention a little bit. But I also wanted to use this chapter for a couple reasons. I wanted to create kind of a microcosm of the election that we're dealing with right now, and use that as a way to talk about corruption and strong men and how they can use fear to intimidate and to get people to buy into their worldview. So, Ruby is an anthropologist, so she's going to be thinking a lot about human systems and things of that nature. And I'm going to do some reading around that, and I think it will address some of those things I've been thinking of, and I'm also going to talk about something called servant leadership. But before I get to that, I wanted to just take a total detour and talk about something else that ended up in the book. And I can't quite remember how much of it was in this chapter, maybe if it had been some other chapters, I don't remember. I know I at least touch on it a little bit in this chapter. And that is the Turkish philosopher Aslan and the country or the nation of Rojava. So I know I wasn't sure if people would do this when they were reading it, but I think people might have done it a lot. Very few, well, tons of stuff is made up in my book. But if I mention a proper name like this, almost always those are real, okay? So Rojava and Aslan are real things, and they were really important to me to bring in because they were super inspiring at the tail end of this book. So I'd mentioned the podcast a few times called It Could Happen Here. And It Could Happen Here was, apologize, I can't remember the journalist's name, but he'd done quite a bit of work in Syria and in war-torn countries, and he was just thinking about kind of some of the trends in the United States, and his assertion was that we very easily could have a civil war here. And he spent, 6-8 episodes of the podcast outlining the different ways it could happen and kind of how it all might go down. That these were things I'd already been thinking about, but that podcast was certainly inspiring for this novel, like very, very inspiring for this novel in the beginning. But then at the tail end of writing this novel this summer, I happened to catch that same journalist podcast called The Women's War. And, it's super sad because the United States, it's super sad. Let me just try to explain it quickly. So, a little bit of international relations and politics for a second. So, Turkey has never liked the Kurdish people. Okay, the people... Back up a little more. Kurds, the people who call themselves Kurds, are an ethnic group that's like Iran, Iraq, and Turkey, I believe, the three countries. Back when the Brits broke it all up after Brits and, the victors of World War II broke that part of the world up, they didn't give the Kurds their own country, even though they were kind of geographically centered. They just split it up and arbitrarily assigned them to these different countries. But the Kurds themselves are very tight-knit ethnic group. And they would like to be their own country because they're really not interested in all the craziness of all these other countries. So I guess Syria would have to be part of them. In any event, so, back in the first Gulf War, the Kurds were our allies, and then we betrayed them. I don't quite remember how we betrayed them, but we betrayed the Kurds there. The Kurds fought valiantly on our side. Then skip ahead, there are allies again against ISIS. So, Kurds are living right there in the part of the world where ISIS is very active. And as non-crazy, extremist Muslims, they aren't super interested in the crazy ideology of ISIS. So they don't want to live like that. So they've been trying to be free of ISIS and be free of the Syrian civil war and other things. They want to be free and autonomous and have their own deal going on. And they actually got that for a little while. So in the insanity of the civil war with Syria, they were able to carve out a little part of the world as their own country that they named Rojava. And guys, you got to check it out. I mean, it's crushing what happened to it, and I'll tell you about that in a minute. But this guy Aslan, he is so fascinating. So he's a Turkish philosopher, and mostly it was his philosophy that went into the creation of this Rojava or the Constitution of Rojava. But he was inspired by our own Vermonter Murray Bookchin. And Murray Bookchin is a social ecologist, I believe is what he calls himself, a philosopher who's got some really interesting ideas, and I'd studied them many years ago. And then just as a total side note, I know it, and it's a fun story. I guess, because he's from Burlington, I guess he and Bernie Sanders had some go-ins around the development of the Burlington waterfront. And on the opposite sides, Bernie was on the side of development and Murray was on the side of not developing. I'm not taking a side in that fight, but it's just kind of funny. In any event, so we got Murray Bookchin doing all these, all this philosophy. He is influencing this Aslan, who as a dissident is now in prison in Turkey. But he's been reading Murray Bookchin, and then secretly getting out his philosophy to the people And so they basically used his philosophy to create the Rojavan Constitution. And honestly, I mean, it's one of the most amazing things that I haven't read their whole constitution, but the parts of it that I have read, I mean, they're very much, ecological stuff is written into the Constitution. Gender equity is written into the Constitution. I believe anyone over the age of 16 can vote. There's just, they just are thinking through in their Constitution a lot more than just, pure laws, but also like how we interact with each other and how we intersect with the non-human world. I talked about, agency for non-humans a little bit last time, but those are important things that I think can make for a better society. And so for like half a second, while these people were also fighting ISIS, they were having this beautiful country of Rojava, and this journalist went there and he was, interviewing them and learning about Rojava. And it was just such a great podcast. But then, and I was so inspired by it. But then I realized, that these are the same people who our country just betrayed again. I cried literally that day. So I don't remember when it was. It was sometime, I think, over the summer. And Donald Trump pulled back our troops that were protecting the Kurds from being slaughtered by Turkey and Syria. And I think primarily Turkey. And so even our own troops were like morally offended that we were leaving our allies, because these folks had been fighting ISIS with us and for us, for the entire world. ISIS is bad, don't we hate that, because of what they do? But we betrayed them and we pulled out our troops, and their countries, toast. I don't know what's happening with them now. I don't know if Rojava is existing in any way, shape, or form right now, but certainly the beautiful experiment that was Rojava is pretty much done. So thank you, Donald Trump, for that. So anyway, but I wanted to talk about that. I really would encourage you to check out the Women's War and Rojava, and specifically this Öcalan. I can't remember his first name. Again, I'm bad with names, but Öcalan, with a umlaut over the O. Okay, I'm going to do some reading from this chapter. So what we've got, Lauren and Pedro are thinking about, running for the presidency. And so this doctor I'd mentioned from the last chapter, he turns out to be basically the Donald Trump type figure of the city of Medina. So he's stealing supplies, he's stealing from everybody, trying to whip everybody up into fear, trying to rig the election, disrupts even online stuff for the rival campaign. So it's kind of just, sort of like a mini Donald Trump in this election. So Lauren and Pedro go and they're talking to James and Ruby, the founders, and they're kind of like, what are we going to do about this doctor? He's so corrupt, he's so dangerous, we don't know how to manage it, right? Okay. So we're going to jump in. So Lauren is asking the question, what are we going to do about the doctor? And then here's Ruby. Ruby doesn't mess around with her words here. Ruby answered, we aren't going to do anything. The question is, what are you going to do? Here's the thing. It's not like the doctor waltzed in here showing us his true colors. He came in just like you did. All offers and smiles. Anyone can present themselves as a leader. The question is, what kind of a leader do you want to be? Lauren shrugged. A good one? Right answer. But what kind of a good one? Here's what I've got for you. At the end of the day, the best leaders are actually not leaders at all. They're servants, because they put people first. They lift those around them. They empower others to greatness. That's what you and Pedro have already started. You keep that up and there's no way you'll lose. The only way people would vote for that wretched doctor is if they're scared. Fear is a powerful emotion, and it drives so much more of our behavior than most people realize. We humans think we're so fancy and sophisticated, but in evolutionary terms, we're barely out of the trees. We've got these primal reptile-like brains underneath all that elegant gray matter, and that reptile brain is spirited. It had to be. That's where our fight or flight and freeze is located. That's what kept us safe from danger back when the lions were trying to eat us. The new lions are people like the doctor who traffic in fear, but our brains don't know how to understand those kind of threats. Humans evolved in very small groups where everyone was very similar, and we all knew every other person in the group. With larger communities, we can't possibly know everyone, and people can be so outwardly different from each other that we can forget that we're all the same deep down. The doctor knows this and is exploiting it. He knows that if he can keep people cowering or filled with rage, he'll stay in control. But we have a more powerful motivation than fear, and that's love. You two show the people of Medina that you're all working together for the same goal, and show them that you care about him. That's how they'll trust you. That's how they'll come to love you, and that's how you'll win. Wouldn't it be nice if that's all it took? But fear is a really powerful emotion, so I'm just gonna talk about that for a minute. So the reason fear is so powerful is because it really is one of those first structure, or the response to fear is one of the first structures that evolved in our brain. So yes, we have this reptile-like brain that I was referring to. So if you kind of think about a brain for a second, you've kind of got the brain stem, you've got kind of the primal brain structures here. So it'd be kind of in this part of the brain, and then you've got gray matter, right? The more complicated thought processes and structures that are on top of that gray matter. So the way evolution works is it adds versus taking away, typically. So we've added, more complex structures onto these primal brains that we have. So part of my motivation for really drilling into this is that I don't think we really realize how driven we are by some of these primal instincts and urges. We do tend to think, like Ruby said, my words, of course, but out of Ruby's mouth, we tend to think of ourselves as these really fancy and sophisticated animals. We are so beyond and above and beyond every other creature. We can't possibly think of us as in any way similar. But, several videos, I talked about the rat experiment with the cocaine, and things like that, So really our brains function in many, many ways very similarly to non-human animals. And fight, flight, and freeze is one of the most important ways that, most animals have evolved to be able to survive, right? We have to have that split second reaction to a fearful situation or what have you. And then what they found in terms of how the brain functions is when that fight, flight, or freeze is, discharging, it actually masks the capacity of the prefrontal cortex, or the frontal portion of your brain, to process information and to synthesize information and to understand what's going on. So people like the doctor in my book, or people like Donald Trump, and then other dictators around the world, they traffic in fear. Their main thing is if you are freaked out constantly, your brain cannot physically take in alternate information. You are just scared and you are staying stuck in terror. So if we are constantly, Joe Biden is going to be a dictator. Joe Biden, and, they really like to pick on Kamala because, she's a woman and a woman of color, equally scary. Kamala Harris is going to be the dictator, and they're going to be socialists, and they're going to rip apart your guns, and they're going to knock down your doors and steal your babies, and all this stuff. If you are constantly stressed out about these things, going to rip apart your life, tax every penny you have, your brain is not capable of thinking beyond that. And if you are someone who's kind of already susceptible to that, it's really easy to get you whipped up. And both sides do it to some extent. Obviously, I'm trying to terrify you with this book. I'm trying to terrify you of Donald Trump. But hopefully I'm trying to terrify you through facts and information versus raw emotion. Where you really, really, really need to be careful. And this can happen on the left or the right, because we've seen leftist crazy people like Chavez in Venezuela, who died, and now Maduro, who are using these same tactics. It's fear, keeping people whipped up, keeping people in a state of, incapacity to think things through, and exhaustion. So that, let's bring in cults and narcissism and all that for just a half a second again. So I've drawn many parallels with interpersonal kind of ways in which abuse, treating someone from narcissistic personality, how they can oppress the people they're with. These same ways that cults and leaders and stuff can react to people. So one of the ways that they almost all function, and I see this with Donald Trump, is also to keep people in a state of exhaustion. Because if you're exhausted, you also can't really think things through. So often, like an abusive relationship, people will find they get woken up a lot in the middle of the night, or woken up early, or not allowed to go to bed, or, things of this nature. In cults, that's a huge part of their tactics. Keep the people busy constantly. In fact, and often it's a state of extreme overwork and lack of sleep. Because you really can't think when you're exhausted and haven't slept. So let's talk about what Donald Trump does and how that parallels. In his way of functioning, the chaos is the method. So if we are constantly exhausted by the news, if we're constantly feeling overwhelmed and scared and we want to tune things out, the president also knows that will be an effective manipulation tool, because a good percentage of people are going to simply tune it out because they're like, this is too much. I can't keep up with it. It's crazy. Who even knows what's going on? So they're going to tune it out because of that. The other thing he's been able to really effectively do with his supporters is by the constant drumbeat of insanity that he's got going. That like regular news people and stuff are going to be talking about the insanity, right? And regular people are going to be talking about the insanity. Even if we're exhausted, there's still so much. There's plenty to talk about. But what now he's done, and what many, many leaders will do in both, abusive, narcissistic type relationships, cult type situations, obviously the president, all of them, again, very similar, is that they will, then they're the victim suddenly. Anyone who's speaking out against me is just the victim, or is, they're the bully, and I'm really the victim, and the person in the state of, exhaustion, mental confusion, all of this sort of thing, fear, is not necessarily going to be able to decipher the messages. So Donald Trump's people, I think we as, not Donald Trump's people, for those watching, really need to be aware of how much that has really created a bubble around the president. Because, like, literally, I don't know, just earlier today, I was watching some video, and some guy's like, you're not blaming the president for the China virus, blah, blah, blah. Everyone's just always blaming him for everything. So it's really interesting to me, oops, sorry about that, from the standpoint of someone who observes this type of thought process, that these folks are often obsessed with, the concept of people being individually responsible, the concept of, this alpha male who's like totally in charge of everything and just telling everybody like it is. But yet, again, the breakdown between behavior and what is said on the part of the president. So he might be saying, I'm this, super awesome, tough alpha male. But if you listen to him and you watch him, really what he does is he is constantly the victim. He's constantly whining about how people are mean to him and picking on him and deep staters conspiring and the news is against him. And all of his supporters have really adopted that as their from what I've experienced, number one pushback against any criticism of the president because, you just all like to pick on him, blah, 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 whatever. Oh my goodness. It's a very effective strategy, a very, very effective strategy for control. Okay, so, and then I talked a little bit about, just to talk about the opposite form of leadership for a second. Let's talk about servant leadership, because I mentioned that in the chapter. That is something that was actually developed, I believe, by the Lutheran Church many, many years ago. So I first heard about it well over 20 years ago, but it's a really interesting concept, and I really like it, because it's contrasting this authoritarian type leadership with a totally different model. And what I truly believe is in Joe Biden's heart, just to continue to kind of be on politics, is that, as the leader, your goal isn't to just order everyone around and tell everybody like it is. Your goal as the leader is to bring those other people around you up, to build them up, to create more capacity within them. It creates a more sustainable organization or level of leadership, because you don't just rely on one central figure. It's distributed, so it's more sustainable in that way. And it's also much more empowering, and it meets the needs of people, I think, a lot better. Because, in an authoritarian dictatorship, because this type of way that the leader is interacting with their people is very similar to an abusive relationship. They don't give a fuck about you. They don't care what your needs are. They don't care if you're suffering. They don't care if you're sad. They don't care if you're hungry. They don't care if you're cold. They don't care as long as they're getting what they need, right? This is the same in an abusive relationship, in a cult type situation, and with a leader who doesn't care. So in this situation, when we have a leader who doesn't care, the needs of the people are going to be inherently not met. But if you have a more servant leadership type situation, that is going to be their automatic primary goal, is serving the people. Their goal is not to get richer, to get more fame. Everybody has an ego, everybody wants to get richer, whatever. But that's not their goal. Their goal is to serve and protect and take care of the people underneath them. And so I would love to see a more servant leadership model become part and parcel of popular culture, because it's really not. It's still kind of that top-down authoritarian model in many of our systems. So not just, with the president or cults or what have you, but even, organizations and businesses and stuff. People don't tend to look at it as they're there to serve those below them. That's their role. They look at the people below them are serving them, most often. Okay, so let's see. So that's chapter 18. So let's jump into chapter 19. That's the final real chapter. The last thing is an epilogue. And in this chapter, we're jumping, probably about 60 years in the future. So I think chapter 19 ends on a really positive and fun way. I hope you do too. And in chapter 19 now, our main characters, Lauren, Rachel, and Eric are all gone. So they've passed away. But we're left with the children who were through the novel, so Ben and Khadijah. And in this, it starts out, Ben's getting out of bed, talking to his grandchildren, so he's obviously an old man. Khadijah comes in with her partner, and she's got a grandchild, so she's old too. So in this chapter, I was doing a couple different things. I wanted to give Ben and Khadijah a little bit more time, because, I didn't want the brown people in my book, the brown children in my book, to just be kind of, attachments to Lauren and Rachel and Eric's stories, the white people's stories. I wanted them to have some story too. Original versions had them have a lot more story, and had to cut a lot of that out. I keep saying that, but it was hard to cut all these things out. So Ben had a lot more agency in an earlier version, but in this one he still does. He's still he's lived his own life. We're no longer engaged with his mother or his aunt trying to save him. Now he's his own person. So, and then they had stayed in the city of Medina, but then in older years had moved over to Nassia for a variety of reasons. So they're now living in Nassia. And the chapter is centered around this celebration called Remembrance Day. And so Remembrance Day was just a made-up thing that was like, kind of remembering your ancestors and things that have happened in the past. So not too different from like Dia de los Muertos that we just, are, this time of year. So, or many other religions and cultures have celebrations of their ancestors. So I was kind of bringing that in. And so it's centered around this holiday, Remembrance Day. And so Ben and Khadijah are both giving speeches. One of the ways I gave Ben some agency, and one of the ways that I was hoping to kind of shed some light on adoption a little bit, since that's, also part of my world, is that Ben is able to use the computers of Nassia that have like, because Nassia is like super high tech, right? They've got like every Facebook page, web page, Twitter, whatever, archived. And so Ben goes through these archives so he can discover his history. Because, if we remember one of the first chapters, Ben is rescued after his birth mom has an overdose. He doesn't have a birth certificate with him. There's no name. The reason he ends up with Rachel is because we have this fictitious Department of Children and Families that basically any non-white children without a birth certificate that they'll bring into these detention facilities and whatnot. So Ben really didn't know his story. He didn't have any idea who his birth mom was. He had a picture and that was it. That's how he was able to track her down. So he finds his birth mother, learns about his story, learns that her name is Claire and that his original name was Emilio. So that chapter ends with him being referred to as Emilio. So I'm giving him back his birth name. And part of how I wanted to play in that with adoption was just a little bit is I have exceedingly strong views on children knowing their birth families and knowing their birth stories. And I know some adoptive families prefer the route of pretending like the child is part of their family, denying the fact that there's an adoption, which I'll just tell you guys, the kid almost always knows there's something going on. Please don't do that. It doesn't work. It backfires later in life. Don't do that. Same with birth moms who have different fathers and lie to their children and say that a different man's their birth father. That is not a good plan. It will come back to bite you. In my experience with numerous people having known that. So anyway, I am very against that. I think children should know their story. Children should know their history as much as you are able to tell them. So I wanted to bring in Ben or Emilio learning his story just so I could say a few words about how important that was that he know it. So I liked to be able to do that. And then Khadijah, she actually has a little interesting journey too. So she's one of the main Muslim characters in the book, and she actually gives up her religion as an adult. And there was no dig on Islam or anything, whatever, people leave different religions all the time. My motivation for that was not to speak to Islam in any way, but was just to speak to the fact that we're often born in a faith tradition or religious tradition that we don't necessarily adhere to throughout life. And so I just kind of wanted to play with that with Khadijah a little bit. She's kind of coming into her own, and she realized at some point that, Islam wasn't for her. But, again, no bad things about Islam. I just, that I think that's such a common experience for people raised in one religion and then rejecting it later. I just felt the need to kind of throw that into the novel a little bit. So let's see. So this is it's gonna be really fast. I'm discussing this because it's a short chapter. And so I'm gonna do a reading out of it real quick. Did I decide on my reading? Hey guys, I might have forgot to decide on my reading for this. I did. Okay, so let's see. I'll just decide on a place. I don't want to read the last part because I'll give away too much. Where will we go? There we go. Let's start with this. Okay. At the party, Petra kissed Emilio on the cheek. Mi amor, she murmured. So, Petra is his wife. And her name is in homage to Petra from Jane the Virgin, which is one of my favorite all-time shows. Didn't really like Petra very much, but, like the name. Anyway, I love the show. A child sitting nearby sniggered. Emilio grabbed her hand and kissed it back. Their 8-year-old grandson brought them small pieces of white fluffy cake with red sprinkles on top, and a small girl delivered cold cups of wild ginger punch. Petra and Emilio snuggled together on the couch. Their marriage had had its difficulties, but more ups than downs. When they'd gone through a rough patch early on, not long after their oldest was born, their friends and family helped them work it out. They stayed together and raised 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. 7 grandchildren followed. Parties and rites of passage were an important part of life in Nasya and Medina. Different families had their own traditions that sometimes others joined, but Ruby and James had wanted to create a holiday that could bring everyone together. So they designated 2 weeks each year when residents took off from non-essential work. Chores that had to be done were split up as much as possible so that no one had to keep on the job while others took leisure. James wanted everyone to stay grounded, though, so he suggested a Remembrance Day smack dab in the middle of the festivities to honor those they'd lost and to keep in mind lessons learned. The holiday was designated by a certain phase of the moon at a certain time of the year. This night was not the night of parties and dancing, but of quiet enchantment, candles and incense, flowers and soft music. Nasia and Medina's children would complain of the boredom, only to grow into adults who cherish the holiday as it goes with life. So I'll just do a little short reading there. So I wanted to point out a couple things from that little section. One, I want to talk about rites of passage. So, and holidays and vacations. Americans are horrible about taking time for ourselves. You know, many of us have vacation time we don't even use. We're often made to feel guilty about vacation time or any sort of leisure activities. You know, we have this tendency of working ourselves into the ground. Even our holidays are shorter and shorter. You know, at least we used to have kind of Thanksgiving that we could have, you know, kind of rely on Thursday and Friday to be sacred, you know, but now Black Friday sales, we'll see what happens with COVID. But, you know, it just feels like, you know, funerals, it should be one day, you know, I mean, we don't give ourselves time to celebrate, to relax, to experience life, to enjoy the things that are important and why we're here. And there's a lot of reasons for that in terms of the economics and all of these things that have led into that. But regardless, I think it's unhealthy. And it's unhealthy for so many reasons. But one of the ways that it's unhealthy is we've really lost along the way in terms of the celebrations and everything, other things we've lost rites of passage. Rites of passage are when someone goes through almost a clear status change from, you know, point A to point B. There's something that takes place and it's really clear that they are no longer that, now they're this. So for example, in the Jewish tradition, a bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah, you know, the child goes through the celebration and then they come out on the other side, you know, considered an adult. You know, the Amish have an adult baptism after the people come back into the community from their rumspringa to, you know, commit to the church. These are really clear signs for the person experiencing them and for the community that something has changed, something is different. And so I'd referred in one of the first chapters to Lauren feeling like kind of an imposter to the status of adulthood. And I think that that's a really, really common experience for many people, because we don't have clear rites of passage in modern American culture. And I think we have a tendency of looking down on that stuff as if it's silly or unimportant. But as people, they really do often make a big difference for us sociologically or psychologically in understanding where we're at in terms of connection to our community. And with a world that almost none of those types of things exist, again, we're sort of left on our own to figure it out for ourselves. And it can be really confusing and frustrating for those of us. So, you know, I do appreciate the First Unitarian Universalist Church that I go to. And if you the folks from that church are watching, you know, this church, you know, has brought in some rites of passage. I'm sure other churches have, you know, for your communities. And so I just think we shouldn't discount the importance of that type of thing for us. Even if we ourselves feel like it's a little silly or what have you, they can have pretty deep and powerful meaning and importance for us and for our community. So I want to bring that in, and the vacation time and how we don't rest. And so here it's 2 weeks. They have 2 weeks off. And I like that they split up the chores, you know, because in our society right now, you know, it's the haves and have-nots. So, you know, like Black Friday, you know, some of us can choose to go out shopping and not have that be a day of rest. But for many people, if that's your job, you don't have that choice so much, you know. So really society, and we're seeing that right now with COVID, you know, some of us can work from home. Some of us can, you know, take some of the burden. You know, we have yards, we have bigger spaces. We can rent houses or, you know, do different things to get away from the confines of like a small apartment or what have you. But many of us don't have the money or the capacity, the training, the skills, whatever, to work from home. They're going to need to be out there working those jobs. And we as a society really do need them. And I know, there was some talk early on in the pandemic about the heroes and whatnot, but I don't really think we treat those folks very heroically. So, in terms of pay and the way, the way we treat them just on the job and things of that nature. So, I just think we have a lot of work to do as a society to make it anything resembling equitable for the folks who are on those kind of frontline jobs. So in my world, in Medina and Nasya, there's no one stuck in those types of jobs. The bad, quote unquote, bad jobs that no one wants to do get spread around, which is, I think, a lot more fair way of doing it. Okay, so, and then the very final thing, guys. Wow, it feels so weird to be at the end of my book with even talking to you guys. It was I'll just jump into my personal experience a little bit. It's been really strange to be done with this novel because, I spent, and I, mentioned a few things. I started this late June of 2019, and I had so many things to learn about, how to write fiction and how to write stories and all these things, how to write a novel, that it really kind of took over my life for all intents and purposes. I was obsessed with figuring it out and figuring out the characters and figuring out how to do it and working through plot lines. And, literally it would be every day, much of the day. If I wasn't working on the novel, I was spending thinking about my characters or how to work through something or what to include in the book. Like I mentioned last time, I'm still so mad I didn't do this, but the flags on all the Trump vehicles, like there would be something that would be in the news or I'd see and I'd be like, oh, gotta get that in the book. This was constantly in my head. And now I'm done. And it's strange to be done writing this book. And it's only been, gosh, a little over less than a month that I've been done writing this book. So, almost a year and, 4 months was consumed by this project and now it's done. So that feels good, because I was really tired of writing it and I was really exhausted, but it also feels strange. So that's what this is feeling right now, to be done with even this is feeling strange. But so here's what I'm gonna do, folks. For the last thing I'm gonna do is I'm gonna read the epilogue and then discuss it a little bit. I better discuss it a little bit first. I'm sorry, I should do that. So the epilogue in my book is set 400 years in the future, so a lot in the future. And it's really only addressing the concerns about how climate change has impacted the planet. So I kind of leave this big open question. I discussed it a few chapters back. Will humanity go extinct? We don't know. I'm kind of leaving all of that. Well, no, we don't go extinct. I'll tell you that. But I'm leaving like the conditions of life on the planet to be, sort of ambiguous. I'm not really getting into that. We know that in Medina and Nasya, life hasn't been easy because of climate change and different pollution and things like that have happened. But humanity has survived, okay? But it's not been an easy journey. Let's just leave it there, and then I'm going to read that blog. Okay. Insects chirped in the shadowy verdant fields, and the stars shone bright as ever. The walls shielding Nasya were crumbling, and dainty flowers and herbs peeked about in its jagged crevices. This perimeter of stone and clay had been a silent witness to Earth's utter annihilation and bit-by-bit revival. Moonlight rippled across the surface of the lake as the two boys, almost men, laid in the poking stubbles of grass along the bank. They dreamed tumultuous dreams of trekking the planet and exploring the ruins of a vanished civilization. The boys longed to visit the other settlements where humanity had clung to survival and return to Nasya with the hero's welcome. Outside the city, the boys felt wild and renewed. Their senses were sharper. They took in the breeze flowing across their skin and the light rustle of grass. Embedded in their psyche was the story of what had happened to the world, and the boys felt fortunate to be on the other side of the madness. Yet the earth was a different place than it had been when the high walls of Nasya were built. Raging fires, leveling storms, and rising seas, along with mass extinctions, had taken their toll. The boys' earth was filled with handfuls of plants and animals and other life that were tough enough to endure. The others, spellbinding and majestic, had been lost to time. Like a cruel joke of chemistry, acid-laden, hot oceans turned a brilliant shade of blue, and their waters billowed with ghostly jellyfish. Over the centuries, the miasma cleared and the climate stabilized, and life strived to live. Successive layers of creation grew one on top of the other, spores of rebirth. All the tenacious beings that weathered the storm speciated, and over the course of several million years, filled the planet once again with biological wonder. Gaia was not in a hurry. She had seen epochs of life come and go before. Still in all, the Anthropocene era was over. So that's the end of the book. I feel like emotional reading. It's so funny. I was so sick of my book, and then as I've been working through these videos, I've been reading sections of it, to find what I would speak on, and reconnecting with my story a little bit, my characters and some of the emotion a little bit. So that's been nice. But yeah, with this epilogue, basically what I'm trying to say is, if we don't change, so the whole book is showing little snippets of climate chaos, right? The dust devils in the scene with Lauren, and the stabbing of the shooting of the junkie. I hate that word junkie, but the drug addict. The high winds when the guinea pig thing at the beginning at the pet store, that the people were struggling with the high winds. So I've been weaving in facets of crazy weather through the whole novel. But really by this point, the Earth has progressed 400 years in the future. And if humans don't do anything to address climate change, we'll just keep getting worse and worse and worse. So when I talked in a couple videos back about the scenario planning things that I had read. So one of them was a report. I don't remember who it was. Some think tank or some private group was contracted to run scenario planning for the Australian military around climate change. So a lot of this epilogue and kind of how I created the Earth for the epilogue was informed by some of those worst case scenario plans. So like, for example, just the color of the ocean. So the ocean is like our biggest carbon sink right now. So what's happening is, we keep putting more and more carbon into the atmosphere, but a high percentage of that is ending up getting absorbed by the oceans. So the oceans are becoming more acid. And, what happens when you change the chemistry of something that a creature is existing in, right? They can't continue to live with the different chemistry. So the organisms that are in the ocean right now have evolved to be able to live with a certain, what's called pH. So it's a measure of how much acidity there is in the ocean. Those creatures have evolved to live with that. What we're seeing now is that as the ocean is getting more and more acid, these creatures are not able to adjust to that level of acidity. So there's almost certainly going to be, profound and unimaginable extinctions of ocean animals. There won't be a lot we'll probably be able to do about that because we can't stop the ocean from absorbing the carbon. So we can address the amount of carbon that's in the atmosphere, and we can certainly work on that. But I think, that's going to be, an ongoing problem. And so in these oceans of this 400 year in the future, the chemistry change actually is predicted to make them just absolutely brilliant blue, which is strange and hard to wrap your mind around, than being more beautiful looking and yet being virtually dead. So jellyfish are one of the relatively small number of species that are going to definitely be able to survive these oceans that are so acidic and hot. So there's, a lot of jellyfish are probably going to be a food source for humans in the future and things like that. And the oceans will probably become dominated by jellyfish. And I found that super sad because like my character Rachel in the last video when she's talking about bears going extinct, oh, my son, my 11-year-old, he loves sharks. And it wasn't that long ago that, yeah, he's pretty sharp. And I talk about climate change and things like that enough. He had read something about climate change and he said to me, sharks are going to go extinct. I can't guarantee that. Of course, none of us can, but yeah, probably sharks are going to go extinct, and whales and dolphins and all those beautiful animals. And that's hard for me. That is really, really hard. I don't do well emotionally when I start thinking about all of that. So I try to, like my character Lauren, those walls, you know, that's one of the things I do is I kind of put up a little wall, and I don't want to think too much about that. Because it's so sad. I would rather think about doing something about climate change. So maybe we could avoid some of that. Maybe if we're lucky. So anyway, my goodness, guys, I think that's all I got for you. I don't have anything else off the top of my mind. I am thinking though, like I said, I might do another session, or I'm probably going to do another session tomorrow morning for my Trump supporting friends and family, specifically for them. But I encourage all of you to tune in because I think it might be informative on, you know, kind of some of the facets of Trumpism that might be interesting that I talk about. Anyway, so there's that. And then I was thinking about maybe after the election, like maybe next week, coming on and doing a question and answer because, you know, some people might wonder about different facets of the book or different things I talked about. So I think I'm going to be putting that out there and at least do one more, at least brief session on questions, answer. That's if I get questions. I don't know. If y'all have questions, start sending them my way and I will address that. You know, I might even do something live. Like, you know, I'm seeing in my stream here, you know, as people are coming on, I guess I can bring them into the conversation. I don't know, maybe do that if it's something you guys would be interested. I don't know how I'm doing all that. But anyway, that's all I got for you tonight, except for if you haven't voted, you know, make sure you get out there and vote tomorrow. It's your last day to vote. Bring your mask, bring water, bring coffee if you have it, or, you know, whatever you need if there's going to be a line at your polling place. And then remember, protectthevote.org. If there's funny business and it looks like the election is likely going to be stolen, or Donald Trump is going to attempt to steal the election, doesn't mean he's going to be successful just because he tries, right? But he needs a response to that. And so protectthevote.org is going to let everyone know on Wednesday morning if he's crossed one of those 3 red lines, and I can't remember what those were exactly, but essentially it's, you know, declaring victory without a clear winner being in place. Then there will be rallies across the country November 4th. So I really would encourage you to check that out if in fact that becomes activated. All right. Okay, that's it, guys. This has been super fun, other than feeling like I looked absolutely awful. I don't know what happened with my lighting. These horrible things under my eyes, but hopefully you'll all forgive my appearance. Anyway, all right. Good night, guys.